Hello, this is Booga Booga Master Eat, or you can call me Booga for short. This is how I am known on Discord, right? And part of a Factual Scalars video here, right? Given the task to debunk some of the atoms within the scaling, and possibly more. So from this specific scaling video, he says that every atom contains an infinite-sized universe. The first scan he shows says anything in terms of anything that actually references infinity. Bam! I'll switch to full power and shrink you into infinity. If he is claiming that this inherently means, just an infinite-sized universe contextually, this would be a selective attention fallacy, as the context quite literally says. Shrink into infinity. The definition of shrink means become smaller, right? And infinity, or any sort of infinity, means something that grows greater and greater and never really ends, right? So something that's being shrunken into infinity would realistically result in something that is quote unquote infinitesimal, something that is infinitely small, right? And the second scan shows that someone got shrunken to be smaller than an atom. Now, these scans quite literally shows these balls, which we can actually assume are atoms, are not actually bigger than the person in question. However, though, we can indeed, if we do assume that these are actually bigger, this doesn't necessarily mean anything, as this would realistically only mean that atoms are infinitely small. If you are saying that he actually gotten shrunken to that level in the first scan, which isn't even coherent anyway. And then he also shows that Sonic entered a universe that is quote unquote even smaller than an atom. And he's assuming that this universe is infinite because there's a white screen in the background, I'm guessing, because there's absolutely nothing that even shows that. Right? So realistically, this would be an appeal to belief and simply a hasty generalization. Just because we don't see any limit to something does not necessarily mean it has none. For example, I can get trapped underground and, not see any limit to the darkness. However, that doesn't mean the darkness is infinite. So all of the other statements made in this statement, in which he's trying to get this atom to boundless, right, doesn't necessarily make any sense, as not even a higher infinity was even established in the first place, which is entirely the point of an inaccessible cardinal and high 1A inversive battles. Okay, so let's get into the cosmology that this video is trying to show here. So it's trying to say that this hand here, or this someone in question, has the power to break a zone with his bare hands. So far, millions of multiverse zones have been destroyed by this thing. Millions is a finite number, meaning the scan does absolutely nothing to prove any of the scaling, unless you're trying to prove that a specific character scales to that specific part of the cosmology. The second scan shows there are infinite variations of our worlds. Some are very similar, whilst others are vastly different, entire universes separating from one another. Now, realistically, we can actually dismiss that scan via just blatant hyperbole and therefore a hasty generalization if we really wanted to. However, though, since it does say universe can indeed mean quote-unquote all of space and all of time in any scientific definition, then we can indeed assume that these are, at the very least, 2C structures, or low multiversal structures, or at the very least that these universes are separate. However, though, assuming that they're separate space-time continuums, though, would indeed be somewhat fallacious, as we do know that they didn't even specify any difference in time whatsoever, and they even used the context of world. World doesn't necessarily refer to universe unless it's in very, very specific context in which one universe is already established, right? So this also gets supported by the fact that in the scan there's literally multiple Earths, right? So realistically, right, we can realistically more contextually assume that this scan refers to an infinite number of planets or an infinite amount of finite structures, right? But if you really want to, we can assume these as different universes, right? Now, the second scan here from the comics says it's working. I can see far beyond the other realm, alternate universes, endless variety of realities, infinite galaxies housing countless worlds. Now, this indeed has enough context for a an infinite multiverse, if you really want to actually interpret it that way. This can indeed be referring to infinite planets, as I said before. However, though, this does not refer to a higher infinity, as some would actually, estimate it to be. For example, we have the fact that these alternate universes, endless variety of realities, infinite galaxies housing countless worlds. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these infinite galaxies, right? Each universe necessarily has an infinite amount of galaxies, right? Obviously, throughout infinite universes, since each universe creates a galaxy, this would inherently mean that each universe, this would in total an infinite galaxies throughout this entire multiverse it's referring to. So this is not referring to a higher infinity without further context. Alternate universes, endless variety of realities, infinite galaxies housing countless words. He literally structures infinite galaxies after infinite universes is established, right? This would mean that this would only support the contextualization that, there's infinite universes would obviously equate to infinite galaxies as well, not that there's infinite galaxies between each universe, right? And housing countless worlds does not necessarily mean that each galaxy houses a planet, right? This would simply mean that the universes house countless worlds, right? So this would inherently mean that the universes itself are countless worlds, as obviously an infinite amount of universes would mean an infinite amount of worlds, right? So these again are not separated by a space-time continuum. So even assuming that these are an actual infinite multiverse is actually pretty fallacious in itself. However, though, we can indeed interpret it to that pretty contextually if you want to interpret it based on scientific theories in which we have a multiverse in which there's separate space-time continuums, right? However, though, that's basically the context of the scan. So in terms of the higher planes of existence, it shows the scan which says we evolve into a higher plane. Moments later, a higher plane of reality. Our father saw me in a dream. Elsewhere, in a realm outside time, space, the entity who was once Knuckles, the echidna, senses. So basically, it is referring to a higher plane in the first scan. The higher plane that it's referring to realistically is not really contextualized. However, though a higher plane, right, does not necessarily equate to a higher plane of existence that this person is trying to get at, right? So this higher plane can just be referring to, higher meaning further inside the upwards direction, upwards meaning the direction that is opposite from from gravity, right? So realistically, we can just equate this to he is simply higher, right? Moments later, we're in a higher plane of reality. Our father saw me in a dream, like this. So, if you're really trying to equate this to a reality fiction transcendence to equate a higher plane of existence, that would be fine. However, though these scans do not necessarily equate that, right? Moments later, on a higher plane of reality, our father saw me in a dream. Now, realistically, right, you can indeed interpret this to a reality fiction transcendence. However, though, there isn't necessarily enough context to that. For example, our father saw me in a dream means absolutely nothing. For example, you can dream about your parents and you don't necessarily in a higher plane of them, right? Meaning that this is a hasty generalization, again, and a slippery slope to just assume that this is a dimensional transcendence. However, though, what would realistically equate to some sort of dimensional transcendence is a realm outside of time space. The entity who was once Knuckles, the echidna, senses, right? So in a realm outside time space, right? So outside time space is not necessarily a real term. However, though, if you equate these two, this would obviously refer to outside of space-time, which would, inherently mean that this is outside of a space-time continuum, meaning that this person is existing outside of time. Now, since it wasn't necessarily shown that he's moving outside of time or realistically beyond time itself, right? This would only realistically equate to Knuckles here, or whoever this character is referring to, or whatever the scan is referring to realistically be
just outside of it, not necessarily scaling anywhere, since he didn't provide any destruction or any sort of actual higher plane. It is not stated to be beyond space or time or necessarily transcendent over it. Neither is it stated to be completely viewing space and time completely infinitely lower, right? The context of something being, low complex multiversal, for example, or fifth dimensional, right, would inherently require you to actually have a complete dimensional transcendence over the time axis, not just being beyond it. For example, if someone is beyond space and time, this would mean that in terms of attack potency, this would mean that they're able to affect things outside of the space-time continuum, which would only qualify for low multiversal. All right, so the next part, or the next scan, right, is referring to the fact that he claimed that he's trying to make is Archie Sonic. The thing that this guy is now trying to say is that Archie Sonic and Game Sonic share the same cosmology, since the events of Solaris was referenced in Archie comics, and Archie Sonic, or Conic, quote unquote, never fought Solaris, it was Game Sonic. Right, so there's nothing necessarily wrong with that logic, not logic necessarily. So we will just dismiss that scan. However, though, I will say right now that just because something actually exists in then something, and yet something never really was referenced in another thing, doesn't now automatically correlate to them sharing the same amount of cosmology or the same world. For example, you can have any verse, right? And you can have one villain that exists in one verse, have the same villain referenced inside of another verse, however, though not necessarily interacted with by a character from this different verse. However, though, since these are from the same creators, right, you can interpret it this way, however, though this does indeed seem fallacious. For example, Tails exists within Archie Sonic, right, or the Archie comics, right, and Tails also exists within the games, right? Does this mean that this Tails is automatically the exact same Tails? No, because they do different things within the stories. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is because of the fact that just because one thing is referenced in one thing and it's referenced in another thing, however, that was not directly interacted with, doesn't necessarily mean the cosmology of said thing is exactly the same. So realistically, this would be a hasty generalization, as I said before. This would also be an appeal to belief, and this would be a false equivalence fallacy and also a dissociation fallacy via just assuming that one thing exists in multiple cases. This case is automatically applied universally, which is obviously untrue. So he also says this is backed up by the fact that Sega has said everything is canon. Now, since this tweet is very, very sus, we can obviously have, your own contentions with this. However, though, we will go on assuming that this statement is indeed true. However, though, it wouldn't necessarily make that much sense, assuming that they would be replying to this or replying to a tweet from Poyo Poyo. Poyo Poyo, is known for actually creating a Tetris game. Now, he then claims Sonic defeated Eggman's death robot that was surpassed by Infinite and which was powered by Phantom Ruby. Hold on. So, wait, wait, wait. Okay, so he claims, right? So the scan itself says the Earth Egg robot has no. I've prepared Infinite to become the complete and ultimate form, right? So just because this thing that's like created Infinite doesn't inherently mean that it is stronger than Infinite anyway. But assuming that the logic is indeed true, right? The Death Egg robot is surpassed Infinite. This contradicts his next statement, in which he says Infinite was stated to be Sonic's strongest villain, as the Death Egg robot, we are assuming, is a villain. So he just directly contradicted himself. Sonic's most powerful enemy yet, Infinite. Even heroes need help, so you must be. Well, I mean, this can be interpreted as, actually like a actual true statement. So that's not necessarily contradicted at all in the scan itself. However, though, you do need to realize that the previous scan kind of contradicts that statement, and this context of this statement made, can actually be sort of vague. For example, it's stated to be powerful, right? Not necessarily strong or like faster or like any sort of other
way of interpreting it, right? So realistically, right, this being Sonic's most powerful enemy yet doesn't necessarily make sense, right? And it's you could also bring up some more contradictions by the fact that Shadow, without his inhibitor rings, right, which was indeed a previous enemy to Sonic, was actually able to blitz a lot of Infinite's army inside of one of the games. So this is kind of a uncontextualized statement and is also contradictory. He also says that Sonic defeated him in base form, which we will just assume is true, right? So this doesn't necessarily mean anything so far. So he then says, and Eggman with the Phantom Ruby created null space. Right? The scan says infinite abilities are empowered by the Phantom Ruby, which can create universes with space times like the Egg Reverie Zone, then the null space, which is closed off from everything. This includes imaginary world, a Jungian orbit type. This obviously makes null space dimensionless. This is obviously not any scan from any game, as it is referring to a summary of multiple realms, actually already referenced within the series, and this is not necessarily a scan which is directly inherently made in some game or actual some official source. It is just a white screen of text. So there does need to be actual sources for this scan made. However, though, let's actually assume that this is actually true. Right, so let's assume that the Agraviri zone and null space, right, are actual space-time continuums, and the Phantom Ruby powers both of them. So he did say before that the Death Egg was powered by the same Phantom Ruby. So you can argue that this Death Egg robot, at its absolute full power, is scales to these two space-time continuums, which would be low multiversal straight up. Okay, however, though, he did actually claim that imaginary world, a Jungian archetype, is dimensionless. Now let's actually discuss about Jungian archetypes real quick. So a Jungian archetype are metaphysical ways, or more so supernatural ways, to describe human consciousness. Right, human consciousness containing things like ego and unconscious or subconscious thoughts, such as anger, and form things like emotions. Right, concepts of emotions, concepts of ideas such as memory, knowledge, and such like that, right? The only problem is that these are realistically just metaphysical ways to describe human consciousness. Now, you could argue that a definition of metaphysics does indeed refer to something that governs concepts like space and time. However, though, what does spirituality mean? Anything that is directly spiritual or directly supernatural in a sense, right, would refer to something that is indeed metaphysical or is at the very least non-corporeal. That is exactly what spirituality is. It refers to metaphysical things, right? So if you were to try and argue that Jungian archetypes actually just operate off of metaphysics, which automatically gives them a specific tier or dimensionless or outerversal, quote unquote, right? This would realistically mean that Gon from Hunter x Hunter, who is able to manipulate Nen, which is just a blatant spiritual ability which actually functions off the concepts of actual emotions and restrictions, right, automatically become outerversal. This is obviously fallacious, as these abilities are made to actually power up finite three-dimensional things or three-dimensional attacks, and are used to destroy three-dimensional things, right? So things that are automatically spiritual or metaphysical do not inherently correlate to strength automatically, right? And we'll apply this to Jungian archetypes. And it's also Jungian archetypes just get directly contradicted for the fact that Platonism apparently exists inside the verse, and Platonic concepts do not necessarily coincide with Jungian archetypes. Archetypal concepts are concepts that directly coincide with each other, and if one concept is destroyed or altered, all the other concepts get altered as well. However, in Platonism, that doesn't necessarily happen, right? These are just two completely different systems that directly contradict each other. Also, concepts such as emotional things, such as anger, beauty, death, love, or knowledge, right? All of these things are subjective concepts, or just refer to things like, things just directly correlating to the human body. For example, death medically or objectively is just when a life form's heart just stops pumping, right? Anger is referred to as the amygdala inside the brain. right? Or just like triggered by the amygdala inside the brain, right? So all of these things, right, are more so just movements that connect to, very small things like, particles inside the human brain. Obviously, those objectively do not really scale that high. Now, subjectively, right, subjectively, you can make arguments that you can actually get these abstract to dimensionality. The problem with this is that subjective concepts, right? Now, if you're trying to put this in a subjective manner, this means that someone could have the highest interpretation of something and the lowest interpretation of something. For example, someone can say that these concepts are absolute boundless and nothing in fiction, real life, or any conceptualization whatsoever can surpass a Platonic concept, whilst one will say this concept is zero, nowhere, below zero, negative D, right? Realistically, right, this means that anything subjective is automatically put to zero, right? You need to actually make these concepts objective in order to actually get them to scale anywhere, right? So this is why things like Platonic concepts or archetypal concepts or concepts in general need to be scaled, which is why the only concepts, quote unquote, that actually scale anywhere are actually dimensionality, space, and time. And this is where you would scale any other abstract concept to in order to actually get it higher. For example, the concept of anger or concept of death. If this automatically does not scale anywhere. However, though, if it's stated to have it so that death operates over the entire universe, okay, the concept of death is inherently now universal, right? However, though, if this concept of death is now stated to be beyond the concepts of space, time, and dimensionality, you now have an outerversal construct or an outerversal concept. The problem is, in all of these fictional worlds, they don't actually have an established cosmology or an actual established transcendence with these concepts to actually get them to these places. It's not like Dragon Quest where they just directly say that the concepts of space and time are directly irrelevant to the concepts of chaos. And this is just referring to the imaginary world just being a Jungian archetype, right? And realistically, Jungian archetypes in general are completely based off of consciousness and unconsciousness or collective unconsciousness, right? Or have concepts that arise through these things, right? Which are realistically just receptors moving inside the brain and, sensors actually being triggered inside the brain. So realistically, without actually scaling these in the most objective sense, this is realistically only brain particle level in terms of power. So the imaginary world doesn't necessarily scale anywhere. And since these imaginary worlds are Jungian archetypes, which are not supposed to be physical, right? This would realistically just make it so that this is nothing, meaning that Phantom Ruby is able to power nothing or lower planes, because we know that dreams on the Versus Battles wiki are actually just described as a qualifier for the hypoverse level tier, which refers to lower dimensional structures, meaning that Jungian archetypes do not necessarily scale anywhere, right? So then we also have, the last statement, which says that, it's a world of nothing created by the Phantom Ruby and closed off from every dimension. Now, every dimension, we know the term dimension can refer to a universe, right? It doesn't necessarily have to refer to different spatial or higher levels or planes of existence automatically. That would obviously just be a hasty generalization and a lack of context fallacy or lack of context fallacy. It's not necessarily referring to that automatically, so we actually determine what dimension is most likely in this context. And since it is closed off from every dimension, right? Closed obviously meaning restricted from, closed off meaning restricted from, and stuff like that, would mean that it's just closed off from the other universes or outside of these universes, right? So Sonic was actually able to have author authority or story manipulation based off of scans that directly refer to, manipulating stories or changing the stories and stuff like that. Realistically, this is just time manipulation at its finest or at its absolute best, or realistically just him being able to change the future realistically, or just like looking upon a past and literally just trying to change a future made upon that past. For example, the entire point of modern society today is to actually advance from medieval times and such like that, right? So Darkspine Sonic does not have theoretical author authority, right? Which people would try and interpret it as actually just being above everything, right? So, in conclusion, right, he tries to say that this scale is four layers into infinite boundless. realistically, realistically, from what I've gotten here, right, in terms of any character actually being scaled to anything, the best example of this is the Phantom Ruby, or that one hand that's holding in millions of universes. Right now, these millions of universes, as I did say before, can be interpreted more likely to just be finite universes and not necessarily space-time continuums. However, though, if you do try and make the argument that Solaris inside of his scale was stated to destroy all possible timelines, right? The timelines have no actual specific scans that prove that there's infinite different space-time continuums. However, though, if you do want to say that this infinite multiverse is actually referring to an infinite number of space-time continuums, and him being able to, eat all of it, right, can scale to multiverse plus. However, though, more reliably, this is only low multiversal, as we do know, as we did see inside the scales, that there's not enough evidence to conceptually prove different space-time continuums in the infinite universe scans. And the only thing that he did try and say is that the Phantom Ruby can hold different space times. So, realistically, to conclude this more reliably, high universal at a low ball, low multiversal at a mid ball, and multiverse plus at a high ball via this scale. This scale is butt cheeks. Do not actually get based off of this. The link is going to be in the description.
Hi everyone, my name is Goku Monkey King, or you may call me Gokunax. My disc tag is Gokunax. Nice to meet you. Let's get to the debunk. Now then, the Sonic fanboys think of the Jarngian archetypes scale anywhere to outer. Well, no, we'll be debunking Sonic tards. Yeah, alright. So basically, it's talking about a dream at the deep valley of the psyche. Well, the problem is that dreams are mental and abstract to our reality. We don't actually form them in actual physical manifestation that is known as physical correlation with our own reality. It's subjective. It has no physical correlation with anything that we actually see or exist in actual reality. It's a mental plane of existence. In Jungian archetypes, it's part of the collective unconscious, which in the collective unconscious, it holds in untold dreams, past and memories and knowledge that we won't know we've already have in our own consciousness, or we can say as the ego. The ego is basically our consciousness where we actually draw our own true manifestations of thoughts, emotions, etc. Things that are subjective to our world and things that we can perceive on a consciousness level. Basically a dream is practically aside from the consciousness realm, which is you could say another subjective realm from that realm, but you can say that it's also mental based on how you follow Platonism and theory, etc., etc., etc. So basically, junk theory is an abstraction. It's an abstract mental concept that has no government in reality, and basically, it's non-physical and non-realitical or non-realistic. It has no universal applicable axioms. Saying that it has any universal applicable axioms is just so retarded by the fact that humans are only three-dimensional beings that only views these theory on a three-dimensional level, as you cannot perceive it on a higher dimensional axis, because you would have to justify being objective in the verse and being universally applicable to the verse and scale the verse in order to scale this theory somewhere. it'd be a hasty generalization and an appeal to assumption that it actually scales to the verse because it's a theory. Well, you don't actually have to prove it exists in the verse. You just need to scale the character using this concept of the scale, the dimensionality these characters are on in order to scale these characters and this theory anywhere higher, but without any actual evidence or any actual theory of where this theory actually scales at. You just be conflicting with conditions and and proclaiming that it because it's a mental concept. It's a concept, therefore it's universal. But you would just be appealing to assumptions and burden of proof and hasty generalization, as you would have to suggest the evidence that it's a universal applicable axiom and it's on a universal axiom. You would have to proclaim the evidence that it's actually physical and actually not non-mental. Otherwise, I can just dismiss this as Sagan standard on this, but via Sagan standard and disjointed reasoning. So basically, Physique in Greek's mythology is practically known as the human soul, mind, or nature, where basically it's actually hold over our personality, our thoughts, our ideas, our memories, etc., 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 whatever is existing as a mental idea. It's basically practically part of the human mind, and and it's actually part of the thought where we actually create things out of thought. But no, it does not actually mean it has a universal applicable axiom. It just means that we can perceive these thoughts on a three-dimensional level, but not on a higher dimensional axis, and that needs to be proven. Because something that has no universal applicable axiom can't scale anywhere if it's already mental and an idea, which mental ideas are abstract materials that don't govern reality. It's and concepts are their own contingent entity derived from a mental idea, a general notion, and not a physical applicability. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm back again with the second debunk. All right, so this second scan is talking about collective unconscious. But in Jung theory, collective unconscious is the subconscious universal place that is called memory and knowledge in dreams, which are so basically it's where another plane of existence in the mind where it's actually separate from the consciousness, where it actually views untold things that we don't actually understand in the consciousness as subjective from our own personal consciousness view, right? It's basically irrelevant to the consciousness that we're actually experiencing every day. We wake up and we experience new things. It's basically something we actually don't understand and we actually try to understand on an instinctual level, but we can't actually understand on a consciousness level because it's separate, meaning that it's irrelevant to to the consciousness level that we have to experience. Consciousness is basically everything we feel, we think, we personally want to do in life. And practically, collective unconscious is basically where we hold over untold knowledge that we've already known, that we keep in the subconsciousness level where it has no applicability to the ego, which is basically the place where human consciousness actually views these ideas on a consciousness level. So basically, it's irrelevant to the part of the ego and the human consciousness. Thank you. Mathemat. All right. Hello, my name is Goku Monkey King, and it's nice to introduce myself. I'm on Discord. My Discord tag is GokuNext. All right. I've been hearing that Sonic fans say mathematics actually exists in Sonic's first. Well, not inherently because mathematics don't inherently scale you any higher than high outer. you would need an ontological scaling to actually scale it somewhere. All right, mathematics is an abstract idea that follows logical deduction and principles that are fundamentally derived from mental concepts. These concepts are theorems, formula, and number, etc. They're basically the fundamentals of to understand the basis of mathematics. Basically, you use this concept to actually measure the amount of mathematics that actually exists in geometry. For example, r equals 1, 2, 3. It's a basically Cartesian coordinates, basically in each position being measured in a dimensional line. Basically, I've heard arguments for Sonic's first have a type 4 multiverse, but no, you would have to prove that all mathematics actually exists in the verse, such as Hilbert spaces, quantum mechanics, etc. All those types of theories to actually exist in the verse for this actual mathematics actually scaling higher. Basically, at the best, you can scale the mathematical realm in Sonic's first just be 3D without any ontological context placed on it. Basically, you would have to be intellectually dishonest to saying that since mathematics, it says mathematics, therefore it would be referring to all mathematics, but you would have to prove that all these mathematics exist in the verse, because that's a nominal fallacy and it's a burden of proof. By following the law of second standard, you would have to prove this argument is actually valid and arguably true by ontological axiomical evidence.